Hello, my name is Chris Carpenter of Bienabee Technologies. Today we have a live recording from 9/15/2016 at the Seattle Vivit chapter meeting. Louis Tadman will be presenting on the findings from an assessment conducted for ADP, and we'll discuss how Bienabee was able to increase their automation efficiency by more than 50%. Let's listen in.
Louis with Bienabee Technologies. Been in the HP space for a long time now, 6-7 years. Maybe not as long as some people, but we really specialize in all the ADM tool sets, and the past focus on a lot of these groups has been around business service monitoring. So this time we wanted to kind of focus on the quality tools. I am generally, we wear a lot of hats, but director of services, making sure everyone we interact with is getting absolutely everything they need, help scoping projects. So one of our consultants, Josh Bryan, actually did this assessment. He's actually at Las Vegas Sands right now, so I'm going to be presenting. And just a general overview of what we're going to discuss, which will probably be on the next slide, is a look at ADP's implementation of ALM, UFT, and Load Runner, how they're utilizing it, some ways that we found that they can improve. Did a gap analysis and found some additional tools and utilizations that they could do. So there's a lot of stuff in here. I might not be able to dive into everything extremely deep, but if you do find something that you're interested in having a little bit more information about, send me an email or send us an email. Get in touch with Chris. We'd be happy to get you any information you need. So a little bit about us. We are headquartered in Bellevue, Washington. We are HP partners. Pretty much everyone at Bienabee, except for Carrie, she's very technical as well, but we all are very highly skilled technical people. We like to put that first when it comes to our clients, and when we deal with people, we want to make sure that they're getting the absolute best that they can. We find that we are often chosen to provide services for a lot of the very complex solutions that are out there, and we also help provide HP software support around the ADM suite. And our main focus is that the clients that are leveraging these tools are getting the absolute maximum ROI on their investment. And a lot of times we find that providing assessments helps clients realize that there may be features of the tools that they already own that they're not leveraging, or there's additional ways and capabilities that they could take advantage of. So that's kind of what we're going to look at. We worked with a lot of people as service providers. This is a client sampling. Probably see a lot of people here. So a lot of our consultants have dealt with a lot of different variations, from insurance to government contracts, technology. So I'll get started right here. So the three parts of the assessment. So this was a unique environment. At ADP, they have about 8 different ALM instances, which was actually consolidated down from around 30 at one point in time. And the different instances are based on the different business silos. And this was an interesting assessment. Sometimes we go in and we take a look at just purely the ALM platform. Is it functioning well? Sometimes we look at just UFT. How are they implementing the features of UFT, and how are they scheduling their tests to be executed from ALM? A lot of times we do methodology assessments, where we look at how they're utilizing the tools. Are they taking advantage of the features? This assessment was unique in the fact that we looked at all these aspects, and we helped them find improvements. We found areas that they were doing really well, and additionally we found a gap analysis for things that they could do a little bit better, and additional technologies that they could wrap into their suite that might provide additional benefit. And one of those things will be ALM Octane, which you will hear about after this presentation. And lastly, we wanted to provide a roadmap. Ideally, they want to know where they could be in 5 years, but we wanted to give them an action plan for things that they could start doing today that would help them get where they wanted to be within the next 2 years. And then lastly, we have a complexity matrix of a lot of the findings at the end of this that we made, and the ease of implementation and the amount of benefit that they would find from it. So the first part of the assessment was people, process, and technology. So we looked at the technology that they were using and the usage of the technology. And so they were currently using HPE ALM. They have the full license version. They have unified functional testing, and the versions they were on 12.21 for both of those. And they also had Load Runner, which is owned by the business. This particular division was leveraging it, but not as much as they could. And we'll see some of the recommendations for that a little bit later. We wanted to take a look at the product mix and how they were integrating ALM and UFT. And there was a lot of things they wanted to, of course, increase productivity from the way that they're using the tools and in a people perspective. Who is leveraging these tools? How are they interacting with the tools? They also wanted us to take a look and deep dive into the actual UFT scripts that they had and analyze that. And they were leveraging the business process testing functionality as well. So as far as the ALM infrastructure configuration goes, when we take a look at this, we look at the different ALM nodes that they have set up. In this particular case, I actually have a diagram of this. They had 3 separate ALM nodes, and they had a Oracle RAC cluster database, and they were leveraging, since when you have multiple HPE ALM nodes, you have to have your file repository stored on a NAS, network attached storage, and so they were leveraging a 1 terabyte network attached storage as well. So we started by looking at the actual ALM platform and all of the actual technology components and infrastructure that makes it up. Then we looked at the ALM feature usage. What was unique about this division at ADP is this was a pre-production deployment regression test instance. That's the primary focus of this. It was a single project. They had around 100 users that were leveraging this. They have, we don't know if they were using every single one of these, but they had 15,000 business process testing components and around 5,000 business process tests. And these were all bundled into regression test suites that they would run weekly on production deployments. So this is a unique implementation of ALM where it's not necessarily leveraging all of the capabilities of having multiple projects and whatnot, but there was definite improvements that we found and can help them with. So that was the ALM feature usage. We also wanted to look at the ALM or the UFT feature usage, and they were integrating UFT with ALM. If your business does have both UFT and ALM, and you're not leveraging ALM to store your scripts and schedule your execution, there's a lot of feature and benefits that you're missing out on with that. And lastly, we looked at their UFT script optimizations. We wanted to dive into the actual code of the scripts that they had. How are they leveraging their function libraries? How are they leveraging the shared object repositories? Are there things and enhancements within the actual code itself that we could find to help them out? So those are the different technology pillars and things that we looked at. And then we're going to start by looking at the first topic, which was the ALM configuration review. They were actually set up very well as far as as far as their infrastructure for ALM goes. They had 3 ALM server nodes, a high availability setup, and each node had 16 gigabytes of RAM, and they were leveraging an Oracle RAC cluster database. If you guys do have a bunch of users on a single ALM platform, what they generally say is for every 100 users you have, you should add another ALM node. That can vary depending on the amount of reporting and analytics you're doing off there. If you have things like text search enabled on the database to allow you to quickly find assets. We found that their usage of the infrastructure is actually very well set up, and they were well leveraged for future growth. We also do recommend high availability setups for the fact that if one of your ALM nodes goes down, you still have access to it. And they had an F5 load balancer set up to direct traffic to each of their ALM nodes. And of course, when you have multiple ALM nodes, we have found in some other assessments and some clients this is actually a support case where they had 3 ALM nodes, but they had the repository stored on one of the nodes, which is not what you want to do. You want to make sure that if you do have multiple ALM nodes, they have a network detached storage. Then we took a look at the performance analysis of the ALM platform via QC Sense reporting. So if you guys aren't familiar with QC Sense reporting, it's built into the ALM administration console, and it provides you a pretty deep set of analytics on the actual performance of your ALM platform. You can do things like look at your different threads, memory thread usage on the ALM server. You can look at client reaction time for different actions performed in the database. You can focus in on a specific user if one user is having issues. You can set up a filter in your QC Sense report to see what this user is doing and how it's affected. If you've leveraged workflow in your ALM modules, you can also have it analyze the latency that may be happening from your workflow, and which will help you optimize it. So if you aren't familiar with QC Sense reporting and you are having performance degradation on your ALM platforms, that can really help you find out where that is. So it will break it down by network latency, client-side latency, database latency, and at that point in time, it can really help you pinpoint where you can improve performance on your ALM platform. So if you aren't familiar with that, you can enable that with some site configuration parameters. And it's right in the left-hand administration module menu. I forgot exactly what it's called right now. But again, if you want more information on that, we can definitely get it for you. We also took a look at configuration parameters. So like I just mentioned, to enable some of the performance analysis features via QC Sense reporting, you need to add some configuration parameters to the ALM database. We found some other things that they weren't leveraging. Enable legacy Excel reports. I happen to really like those. I like to write very specialized queries, and adding in VB post-processing to Excel reports. So that was one that we found. We also found enable test coverage by test instance to help them get a little bit more detailed analysis on the requirements coverage by test instance to help pinpoint exactly what test instances were passing and failing on which requirements. By default, it's on the test case level, so if you add that test case to 20 different test sets, it's going to show you the last pass-fail status of that test case. So that was a good one. One thing that we found that, since they did have 15,000 business components, oftentimes the regular filters that they had built in weren't quite getting them the filtration options that they needed to find the components when they needed to use them. When we set up a new project, we always recommend adding metadata to components if there's anything that you ever need or would want to find. It's used for filtering to find assets in your views in ALM, as well as reporting. It really helps out. So they didn't have that. We thought it might be good to leverage the text search. You can enable that on the DB, and that will allow you to actually query text strings and entities in ALM. And then license utilization. They were doing well with license utilization, and based off of the fact that they had a very robust infrastructure, we recommended adding text search to the DB because, as you can imagine, if you're querying for text strings in a database, it can hamper performance a little bit if you're not set up for it. So that's something to consider. This is a diagram. They had some other tools, which we'll talk about in when we're talking about the gap analysis. I'll just give a little sneak peek of some of the things we recommended. The infrastructure, you can see the 3 ALM nodes. They had the RAC Oracle database cluster, network attached storage. And this component was not there, but we put it in there as a recommendation. They were already, and I don't know why companies do this. They have a tool that can handle everything. But the developers had already started using Rally for defects, and they were kind of entrenched in that. And if you aren't familiar, HPE ALM has a great synchronizer server that you can set up as a bridge to bring data into and out of ALM. So we thought that it would be good to provide a deeper set of analytics within the single platform, and reporting off that if they were to sync their defects from Rally into ALM and back and forth. And then lastly, just since we were on the topic of QC Sense reporting, I wanted to just show you what one of these could look like. This is just filtered down by a few days, and it shows the number of queries that were executed, the average query time, and the total query time right here. So this is an example of one of the QC Sense reports. All of that stuff is written to the QC site administration database unless you've configured it differently. And so once you enable those parameters, it will start tracking. One thing to also take a look at that we've noticed is some people have this enabled and they don't even know it, and it can be causing performance latency because if it is writing metrics to the site administration database quite often, and you're not even aware that it's doing that, that could affect you as well. So that was the infrastructure review. They actually were set up pretty well. There was a few things that they could enhance that could help them out. Next, we wanted to look at the ALM feature usage. So oftentimes, people think there's one way to use a certain feature in ALM. And in this case, since they were doing pre-production regression testing, they had a bundle of several thousand test sets they would run on smaller deployments that had a full end-to-end regression suite made up of multiple test cases. And one of the main reasons we were there is actually this regression suite would take them 3 days to run. And so they wanted to see if we could help shore up some of the latency with that and find ways that they could leverage that. With that being said, since they were only doing pre-production deployment regression testing, they weren't really leveraging the releases very well. And so releases, requirements, and test plans, if you aren't leveraging these features, there's a lot of ways where you can have automatic linkages created to entities that allows for deeper analytics and reporting to get you better insight. So they weren't using releases, really. We recommended that they at least create one release for the entire year to track all the regression testing. And depending on if they wanted to track quarterly or yearly, we recommended adding a cycle. Because once you have a cycle under a release, you can assign that cycle to your test set folders. And then every time you automatically generate it, if you do want to file defects automatically, they'll automatically be associated to that release and cycle. It'll also help them track their test case execution by fiscal year. So every test execution will automatically be associated with those release and cycles. And since they had the ALM version, they also had project planning and tracking, which they were not leveraging, which I'll discuss later. But that's a way that you can get an oversight of all of your different metrics involved in an entire release. Requirements. So they were using the requirements module, but again, a lot of the requirements had been tested in the earlier testing phases and integration testing and user acceptance testing, which was not a part of this ALM instance. And so what they did have is they had a lot of folder type requirements, which they were leveraging for storing assets, attachments, Excel sheets, documentation. They had very few business requirements, functional requirements, and testing requirements. So one thing that we thought would be good if you are running a production regression testing suite, you know what features should be in your application, and you know which regression tests should cover those features. So we recommended creating an overarching business requirement for each major application feature, and then smaller functional requirements for each of those more granular test cases, or for each of the more granular features in there, for which they could link their regression test cases to these requirements. And again, a lot of what we look at or what we see is we kind of start from the top down, where we don't, to start writing the test cases, writing the requirements, we look at, a year down the road, what actionable metrics do you want to see out of the data that you're accumulating, and what will help you make business decisions to let you know whether or not this production build is ready to be deployed or you need to hold it back. So again, having requirements which are linked to the releases and cycles, and which are allocated to the features of the application under test. We recommended that they create those and then link the regression test to each of those features. Because as we mentioned in our site configuration parameter, which I kind of put the cart before the horse there, which was each time they're running these regression test suites, they can have an overall visibility by looking at that requirement in ALM to see all the test case coverage, which has passed, which has failed, and also for a top-down report of the entire deployment. You can see the health of each one of your requirements. Is when you're linking all the entities together again, you'll see all the defects that are associated with that requirement if you look at all the links. So, and also the requirement traceability matrix associating requirements to which features are affected by and affect other features will allow them to kind of see if one thing is broken, how that affected the rest of their application. Next thing was the test plan. And one thing really unique about this client was They had an onshore manual testing team that would put together the business requirements and put together functional tests. And they would record those tests actually in a video, and then they would send them to offshore, and offshore would automate. So there's kind of a little bit of gap in bridging the manual testing to automation testing. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the gap analysis. But one of the features that we noticed that they were not leveraging, they had a lot of test cases. Each one of them have the steps to log into the application. That's the same in every step, or the same in every most of their test cases. So we recommended that they use the call to test feature, which is you can call another manual test as a step in the main test. So for example, if you had step 1, 2, 3, enter your username, enter your password, log into the application, and you needed to use that in multiple different test cases, you can call that test as the first step in all of your other manual test cases, which gives you a single point of maintenance if the login steps were to change or you wanted to modify how that happened. So that feature was good. That also kind of ties into business process testing, which I'll dive into a little bit more when we get to the UFT section. So test lab. They were using the test lab. Of course, they were running their automated regression suites out of ALM, which is a good thing to be doing. That was great. We noticed that they were not using the execution flow. So if you are not familiar with automated testing from ALM, there's a tab called execution flow, and from there you can set up the order in which you should run your automated tests. If there are data dependencies, for example, you need to create an invoice before you delete an invoice or pay that invoice. You actually select which test cases, and you can create multiple channels or a single channel, and you choose which order these tests should be executed in. And you can also have criteria. So only execute this next step if the previous test has passed, or execute it when this test has completed, no matter what. There's also automated email settings you can set up. Send us an email whenever the test is finished. Send us an email if it's failed. Send us an email if we had an environment issue. And you can also toggle settings to rerun test cases in the event of failure. And again, kind of going off what I already suggested, was assign test set folders to cycles so you can see the test sets and accumulate all of your run data over a certain period of time, and whether you want to do that quarterly or yearly. And for most of you guys, you're probably going to have dedicated testing cycles, your unit testing, your integration testing, your user acceptance testing, maybe regression. So we definitely recommend, of course, allocating test sets to cycles. And for manual testing, when you are running through the manual runner or sprinter and you file a defect, if your test set folder is assigned to a cycle, it'll automatically assign that defect to that cycle. So you get a lot of great things there. Defects. So their defects were stored in Rally, and they were not bringing any assets from ALM in there. So, when you're trying to get actionable metrics from a single platform, that really was somewhat of a hindrance. We did recommend that they set up the ALM synchronizer server, and if they wanted to use Rally as the source of truth for their defects, if that's where the developers are filing them, they could set up that as the source of truth endpoint. They could have one-way synchronization where they're only data dumping defects into ALM for reporting. They could have two-way synchronization where testers could actually interact with the defects that were created in Rally once they've been synchronized to ALM, and it's a two-way sync. So if you do have multiple systems that you're using for tracking purposes, we always recommend trying to synchronize them so you can get actionable metrics. And then they didn't really have too much customizations. We like to add defect workflow. And one thing that we always recommend adding, a lot of people want to know how many times was a defect reopened, how many times was it closed. So one thing we do with workflow, which is VB script in the ALM project customization, if you're not familiar, is we add read-only fields for retest counter, reopen counter. We also like to add defect workflow to help guide the process. And that way, automatically, without users having to do anything, if they do change the status to reopen and they post that defect to the database and save it, then that reopen and retest counter will automatically count up for them. Also, they're not leveraging the built-in ALM reporting, the graphs, and we recommend, of course, just creating graphs and dashboards. It's a great way to see quick data. You can click on certain sections of the bar chart and it will actually pull up that information into a filtered view. You can export that to Excel if you wanted to. What they were using is they were building custom reports by querying the Oracle database and dumping it into Excel. I'd have to ask Josh. I don't think they had the legacy Excel reporting feature enabled, so maybe that's why they decided to actually query the database themselves. And another great feature that I really like, if you're not aware, is if you do create graphs in ALM, you can right-click it and say Share Analysis Item, and you can choose if you want to share that publicly, which means you just don't have to authenticate to ALM. Of course, if your ALM server is within your corporate network, it's going to only be shared within there. You can actually embed those via iframe into portals such as SharePoint or make your own analytics portal. A lot of times, directors of QA, sometimes project managers, they don't want to have to log into ALM and click generate to see that. So these REST reports will automatically generate on a frequency. You can set it up to every 5 minutes to an hour, however often you want to do that via some parameters in the site configuration. So we think that's a great way to give quick metrics and overviews to people. And since they weren't really using these features, we definitely recommended that they get some training on these features. Sure.
I'm kind of curious. I think of Rally as a DevOps tool. And you mentioned the developers like putting defects in Rally, but it seems in the process changes one would do around DevOps, kind of a melding of development with operations, with testing, etc. I mean, I'm a little surprised, dude. Can you really use two tools and try to synchronize, or would one tool not speed up the whole flow?
It could, and again, Josh is the one that did this assessment, so I wish I had the actual insight as to seeing how they were implementing this there. But one of the things, even if, not necessarily that they have to use two tools, at least aggregating the data into a single platform might allow for more actionable metrics, so they can see where the defects were generated and, what the test cases uncovered themselves.
Is it that sometimes companies they form, or there's groups that start using a particular tool, or they might have also perhaps more power over that, or the tools have rolled out in certain groups and they're like, okay, that's going to be kind of the de facto, and then there's another tool, ALM, and then all of a sudden there's this possible need for
Doesn't sound
merging.
reasonable. Rally is an agile tool, so thinking that some parts of a large program or project are delivered using an agile approach, and some are not, and then you were saying just aggregating information. It doesn't sound that unreasonable. We actually do a lot of integration. We happen to use agile managers, that's a little more native integration, but we see a lot of mixture of teams using different tools based on what they're doing and what they're used to. And I think that ALM's become a little bit more open.
Absolutely.
Suite has in general, I think it's...
What you're gonna see in the next presentation with ALM Octane, it really kind of bridges that gap with a lot of things. But a lot of companies we've seen, sometimes they use Jira, and sometimes the same teams are using ALM. And a lot of, again, we want to make sure that people have actionable data, that there's just not defects being filed in one system that the developers are using, and that the testers are completely blind to what to expect. So that's, even, whether or not you want to try to have both teams use each of these entities and communicate via the synchronization is up to you, but we definitely try to get actionable metrics into a single platform any way we can. I ramble a lot, so I'm gonna try to keep up the pace. I love the questions. I want to keep going. I know we have a set amount of time. I could probably talk about this stuff till tomorrow. So I love the questions, though. If we don't get an exact answer, please let me know. We can sync up afterwards.
Just with the eating of food and all that and plate supports, can you project a little bit more so I can hear you back there?
Sure.
Thank you, dude.
No problem. I kind of have a low rumbly voice, so I will project more. Thank you for the reminder. So libraries and baselines. If you are not familiar with libraries and baselines, it's in the management module of ALM, and you can use a library to take, or basically to encapsulate certain ALM entities. You can use it for requirements, tests, automated test assets. I'm bumbling on that right now, and then your business components. What you do with that is you basically get a pointer to all these assets by creating a library. So you can say, I want to create a library of all of my requirements for Q1, or I want to create a library of all of my business components which affects this feature, or everything at once. And then by creating a baseline, essentially what you're doing is you're taking a snapshot of those entities at that exact period in time. A lot of companies do not leverage this feature. You can take libraries and baselines in ALM in most versions. And what a feature that you get in the actual ALM license version of the tool is you actually can share assets across projects with libraries and baselines. So you can synchronize those components into a separate project. It can be a great way to leverage that. So we recommend creating a library and then baselining their automated testing assets once per quarter. One great thing about libraries and baselines, when you have that even for manual or automated tests, in the test lab you can actually run baseline version of tests. So maybe you had a whole set of tests that was set up for a certain version of your application, that they're all set and good to go. You baseline those, you're deploying a new version. If you wanted to continue working on the same assets without copying them, you could continue to modify those test cases and adapt them for the new release that you're working on. And if you ever needed to test that old release, you can run that baseline version of the test. And then, of course, syncing baseline entities across projects. Another thing we always recommend doing if you have the ALM version of the tool is cross-project customizations via an ALM template. So in this case, the client just had one single project, pre-production deployment. They really didn't think about creating a master template. But one thing that's amazing, even if you only have one project, and for those of you that aren't familiar with what cross-project customization is you create a template project, which is essentially just like a regular ALM project. You put your custom fields, your workflow, your user permissions in this project. And for those of you who maybe have 5, 10, 20 projects that you want to, again, report off of or have the same defect workflow, you can push those changes out to a lot of projects. One great example of why this can benefit you is if you have, let's say you're adding 5 custom fields to a defect and you have 5 projects, you go and individually add those fields and perhaps you accidentally added them in the wrong order, they're going to have different references in the database, which if you try to make a cross-project report is not going to allow you to report efficiently. So having a template will allow you to make sure that each field that you add in your project is represented by the same database reference field, as well as if you wanted to change a user permission, you update it in your template project, you can push it out to all your projects at once, so it saves a lot of time. Another really great thing about the ALM license version of the tool, which not a lot of companies are aware, is application lifecycle intelligence. So this particular client, they were leveraging TFS for their source code management and their build, and the developers were using Visual Studios, which integrates with that. So for those of you who aren't familiar, application lifecycle intelligence can help you integrate source code management and build servers with ALM if you want. It's with the newer versions of ALM, the extension is built into the project. You can just create a template project or a blank project and add the extension. It's not going to have the functionality, but you can get a view of the additional modules. So you can view your build servers. You can actually view source code check-ins. The developers can also use the IDE connector customizer to access defects that are stored in ALM from either Visual Studios or Eclipse. And when they check in code, maybe there's a defect that they fixed, they can associate that defect they can associate that code check-in with a defect in ALM, and you actually see that information aggregate on those entities in ALM. It also helps you provide more actionable insight. You can see maybe if one requirement has had 500 lines of code checked in by 10 different developers, that you maybe want to test that with a little bit more scrutiny versus the requirement that had one line of code checked in by one developer. So that's great. Another thing is mail alerts and auto mail. So if you have defects and you have requirements and you have these all linked together, and perhaps a test case is passed and that had a defect linked to it, you can automatically send an email to that developer, and you can pop a notification on that defect saying that it's resolved. Likewise, the notifications go back the other way. So if the developer has marked a defect as fixed, and you can notify that associated test instance where the defect was found and say, hey, this is ready to rerun again. So there's a lot of things that are built into the project customizations that we notice people aren't leveraging. So that's kind of the end of our ALM review. We found a lot of things that they could do and leverage that would help them get more benefits. And a lot of these features are already in the tool. And knowing that these features do exist could help fold in other teams that are a little bit hesitant to be brought into the fold. Because maybe, a lot of times developers don't like having to go into Quality Center to look at a defect when they're in their IDE. So a lot of these features that are already there for you to access could hopefully benefit and help collaboration between teams. So the UFT review. So again, this particular review was done on business process testing methodology. For those of you who are not familiar with BPT, essentially it's like building a test case with modular components. Well, it is building a test case with modular components. For example, if we wanted to use this is one of my things that everyone knows Amazon. If you wanted to build a component to log into Amazon, you wanted to build a component to purchase or add an item to your shopping cart, and then you wanted to add a component to buy everything in your shopping cart and then log out. So you have 4 separate components, and maybe you had 500 test cases. Each time you wanted to log into the application, you could leverage that single component and use it across all of your automation or manual test cases for that matter. It reduces maintenance. So for example, for those of you who use UFT regularly, perhaps the login feature has changed and there's a new authentication or an object has changed properties. You can update the properties of that object in that single component, and it will propagate across all of the different test cases that leverage that. So that's just kind of the essence of business process testing. What we were analyzing here is the automation execution efficiency. As I had mentioned, they had some very large regression test suites with multiple different test sets they were running, which would take 3 days to execute. The maintenance of automation, where if a feature changed, which was being developed onshore, and they adjusted the manual test case, there was a little bit of bridge and latency where they'd have to re-record a demonstration of how that feature has changed, send that to offshore, and have them adjust it. We also wanted to help them reduce maintenance with object repositories, function libraries, anything we could see. Automation data sets from database inefficiencies. So one thing that this client was doing is they actually had a database instance with all of their test configuration, test parameters, and they were actually in each component querying for that that parameter that they wanted to use from the database each time they used it. That's not a bad way to go about it if you want to have dynamic data stored in the database. You might not always want to do that if you have the option to use ALM input parameters if the data sets aren't changing too often, or if you wanted to iterate multiple data sets, you could always use a data sheet. But we definitely noticed some ways that they could use data setup components. So example, having a single component that does a lot of different things. Instead of having the query actually in each one of their components, we recommended that they have a data load component where they can assign all of the parameter values in that component. They can query that data from the database and use those as output and input linked parameters into the other components that needed it. Code reviews, so checkpoints, custom checkpoints, wait operations versus sync, and if exist. Probably get into these, but we noticed that they were using a lot of hard-coded wait operations, which, if you know that you need to stop for a set amount of time, can be a good thing to do. But when you're talking about 15,000 components, if each one of them, is waiting for 10 seconds, you can imagine the latency that would cause if the test is ready to proceed because the object is there in 1 second. You can always use a if exist, and you can add an optional parameter in that exist for, say, 10 seconds. If it finds it in 2 seconds, the test will continue. Otherwise, it will wait for 10 seconds. There's also some inefficiencies with custom check, or they were using regular checkpoints. They were using, with the waiting and the checking of things, they were not checking if things exist. So they would sit there, and sometimes an object wouldn't propagate. They were actually using if or property exists. So they're looking at a specific object to see if a property exists. And if that object property had changed or wasn't there, they didn't have any error handling that could have helped them bail out of the test. So we analyzed several of these business process tests. One of them in particular, on average, would execute in about 8 minutes. and we noticed that in certain outliers cases, this test would hang there for 30 minutes, I believe. I'd have to get the exact information from Josh, but it was an exorbitant amount of time. In certain instances, one test sat there for a couple hours. And again, by leveraging the test execution flow and the retrying and better error handling, if something isn't there when it needs to be there, we always recommend on trying to set up your error handling and maybe adding some custom error handling routines to make sure that you're not sitting there waiting for something that's never going to happen. And as we get into the best practices, another thing that we'll see where we were able to find a lot of gains for them was the way that they were using their function libraries and object repositories. One of the major concerns, which a lot of companies have, is they want to make sure that their assets are protected and backed up. Since they were on UFT 12.21, they did not have Git integration yet, because I believe that was introduced in UFT 12.5. So they wanted to back up all of their code, and we'll get into how they were doing that. And again, I spoke on error handling. I'm going to try to speed up a little because I love talking about this stuff, and I can go for a long time. So function libraries. One thing that was a very big detriment to their performance, which I understand why they thought maybe this was a good idea, but not knowing the intricacies of how business process testing works, it caused them some issues. So each one of their components, they would record, they'd optimize, and then they'd take that code and move it into a single function library. They actually had about 8 function libraries. And for those of you who aren't familiar with business process testing, each component has what's called an application area associated with it, which you can have shared object repositories and function libraries. And when you go to download a component, so you go to run an automated test case, the components get downloaded from ALM, it brings those assets with it. So what they were doing, and the reason why they were doing this is because they wanted to back up the code with Git, was they were recording their components, and then they were storing all of that recorded code in a function in the function library, and they were calling a single line of code to call that function. While this could be good in practice, with the amount of components they had and the amount of code that this built up to, it added a lot of latency to being able to download those assets to the machine. So we recommended, of course, adding the code back into the component. And, as you can see, the third bullet point right here is they can leverage, if they upgrade to UFT 12.5, they can actually leverage Git integration to back up their code. Object repositories, again, the same kind of theme here. They were dumping a lot of their objects into a shared object repository, even if they were only used in 1 or 2 components. It's a great idea to have shared object repositories if there's, let's say the home page, everybody's interacting with the login text box, input box, and buttons. So that's going to be used everywhere. Shared object repository is fantastic. It's a single point of maintenance for all those objects. But if you're dumping every single object into the object repository, again, that's where you get latency for downloading those components. So really want to find the best way to optimize those. So moving some of those objects back into the component themselves, where that only those objects affect that single component, that's where you're going to want to maintain that anyways. UFT best practices. So synchronization. We recommended wherever possible, do not use the hard-coded wait operation if they just need to make sure that something exists, or if they need to check if a property exists. Because a wait, no matter what, will wait that amount of time before proceeding. And it's always best to try to make it as dynamic as possible, to wait if something exists, then to continue and give yourself a threshold of how long you feel comfortable waiting. If it doesn't exist, you can add custom error handling where you can bail out of your script instead of sitting there. And sometimes if your run options aren't configured or your error handling options aren't configured to bail out after a certain period of time, that's where you can run into issues. Parameterization and variables. So the queries weren't really optimized, and as I mentioned, they were querying for data right in the middle of test cases, which could cause latency. Again, maybe you get halfway through your test, and on the 10th component, you're querying for a parameter, and there's some sort of network hiccup that doesn't allow you to pull that data, and you're waiting for this query to finish. So maybe having a data load component where you're querying that data and setting it up before you're in the middle of your test case would be great. Also, there are definite applicable uses for where you'd want to use input parameters and data sheets to link to those input parameters. for iterating a set of data that doesn't change too often. Time slots. So this was a huge win that we found for them. If you guys are not familiar with the lab management extension on ALM, it's pretty awesome. And ALM Octane even goes beyond that, which you'll see next. But there's a lab management extension. And some of you may be also familiar with Performance Center. Essentially what the lab management extension does is it gives you a time slot module. So you can have your test sets and you can schedule them to run at a certain period of time. It also gives you more flexibility to dynamically allocate your test cases to any available testing host. This client actually had 100 VMs that were used for test execution hosts. And what they were doing is they had each test set to run on a single host, and it was non-linear fashion. It would just pick whichever test was next because they were not using the automation configuration in ALM.
Pick any that's available.
Pick any that's available.
Uh-huh.
Right. So since they had all these VMs, they were only leveraging about half of them because they had them hard-coded and allocated. With Automatic Runner, you can leverage the ability to choose a certain host group. But we definitely recommended, to vastly increase their automation performance, to set up their hosts in lab management project, and then allow ALM to dynamically pick any host, and you can prioritize these hosts too. So if you have some that are set up and optimized, maybe they have more memory or RAM, you can pick those as the first host that will be chosen if they're available. But using the time slots allows you to not only schedule the test and to run unattended when you're not there. Also, another great thing, if your scripts interact with GUI objects, you have to actually, if you're running through Automatic Runner, you actually have to be logged into that machine to interact with it. With Lab Management Extension, you can actually configure a username and password, and if the machine, for example, is asleep or locked, it will log in and then run the test sets on those machines for you. So that's a great feature as well. So the automation execution flow in ALM, in conjunction with scheduling via time slots and automatic host allocation, was a big win for them since they had that available to them. And again, lastly, Load Runner. This was very quick. They had Load Runner available. ADP was heavily leveraging it. They really did not have a dedicated performance testing team in this division. Again, they were just yes, Chris.
My was getting tired there. So you said the time slots were a huge win, right? Like that was something that benefited them greatly.
Yes.
And I'm curious if that was something. I don't remember if they had like the license, but was that something that actually cost them anything?
That's a great question, Chris. If you have the ALM license of the tool, you already own ALI, you own Lab Management Extension, so those are features that you can leverage if you have the ALM Enterprise Edition. If you have Quality Center, you do not have those features, but no, it did not cost them anything. It's a feature, and that's one thing that we really pride ourselves on with our assessments. We find that that's a fantastic way to help our clients before even performing any services. Sometimes they know what they need, but no matter what, even if we're there, we like to assess and provide recommendations because they know what they need, but they might not know what they don't know they need. I don't know if I said that right. So they didn't know that they had access to lab management. They're not going to ask if we can help them with it. So yes.
Perhaps they're also saving money on hardware now too, right?
Absolutely.
Because you mentioned 100 VMs that are out there waiting to all run at different times, and they've got it locked to that.
Absolutely. That's, again, helping them maximize their return on investment. They own something that can help them reduce the number of VMs already, because the dynamic allocation, you don't need to hard code on 100 different VMs. So that was another big win. That's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Also, 10 minutes off for me.
All right, I'll try to. I said I can ramble. Sorry, I hope this is beneficial.
Aaron's not. You are.
Yeah. So, and again, if you want to deep dive into any more of this, the happy hour after, we'd be glad to talk with you. If you want to see any of these things in a little bit greater detail, we can work and try to get you a demo set up. So, load runner utilization. They didn't have a dedicated performance test. They didn't have any dedicated performance test regression suites. No actionable data from performance testing. They were using Load Runner. They had a few people with Vue.jn knowledge, but not a dedicated team. They did have other teams that did some performance testing, but again, when they're getting ready for post-production build, the data wasn't there. If you're not familiar with the difference of Load Runner versus Performance Center, when you run performance tests on load runner. You have your load runner box, or you have your controllers and your load generators, and all of the metrics are actually stored on the controller itself. So you go into that machine and get it. So even if they are going to continue using load runner, they could benefit from putting all that performance testing data on a NAS once done with it. And again, no dedicated performance testing team, but they definitely could benefit from that. And again, that kind of ties into some of the recommendations we had. So load runner review. So again, this is additional licensing. If you have load runner, you don't automatically have performance center. But again, for saving on hardware and infrastructure, we recommended that they adapt HP Performance Center. So that same lab management extension that we were just talking about, where you can allocate functional tests to run on a schedule, you can pick time slots to have it run when you're not there. That's the exact same interface you would use when you have Performance Center to run performance tests. If you have both functional and performance tests stored in the same ALM project, you can bundle them into a business verification suite where you run your performance tests alongside your functional tests. Again, if you have multiple controller boxes, you have to have a license for each of your controllers. So if you have Performance Center, you can have, forget the exact name, they're essentially controller licenses in there. So you could run a giant regression or a giant performance test, and while that data is collating, you can use that same license on another box to run another performance test. So it allows you a lot more flexibility. All of the licenses are managed, and you can allocate them to individual projects. You can allocate the different controllers and different infrastructure managed that way as well. And we also recommend that they get a dedicated performance test team that can work. It's always nice if you're baselining your functional tests, also baseline the performance, so you can notice if any feature changes have degraded your performance. So again, I'm running short on time. I'm going to go through our key findings really quick, and then I'll be done. So time slots, that was a huge win for them. It will dramatically reduce overall automation test run time. Instead of waiting for a single machine to be available, they can dynamically allocate it. They can also schedule it to run when no one is there. Functional libraries, not putting everything into a single function library. Functional libraries are fantastic for common repeatable actions that you want to use. For example, closing all browsers. If you put that in a function library, it allows all of your automation team to just call a single function and use that the same logic everywhere. So function libraries are fantastic, but don't put everything that you ever do into a single function library and download it. Object repository, we kind of covered that. Optimizing the objects, putting only the objects that need to be in there. Synchronization. What this was actually is the synchronizing the hosts via the lab management extension. Parameters and variables, using get to backup code. I mean, we kind of talked all this in depth, so I'm going to kind of skip through this. Just kind of an overview of what we covered. Using whatever you have available to you. If you have other tools to get actionable insight, we always recommend checking the latest version of the ALM Synchronizer server, setting that up, and seeing if you can get your data in there. They do have an API for that if you want to build into it, or your own custom sync for a tool that you have. Libraries and baselines will allow them to back up, and if they did want to spin off a new project and bring their assets over with them and archive all of the results that they already had in that single project, they can sync in their libraries and baselines, and again, leveraging the template would be great for that. They did have Perfecto Mobile. We didn't really cover that much. It wasn't a main focus of what we did. But HP's Mobile Center has taken great strides, and we feel strongly that we've heard from HP that their largest development team is focused on Mobile Center, so you can expect a lot of great features coming to that. Structure. So the structure, the general overview was not having the segregation between automation and manual testing, kind of finding ways to bridge the gaps between those teams. Hopefully everyone will be working off the same assets and maybe bringing a couple automation experts onshore and a couple manual testers offshore to kind of bring that together. Another great feature of going to UFT 11.5.2, or excuse me, 12.550 and above is LeanFT. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it allows you to code UFT-like scripts in your actual Visual Studio's IDE or Eclipse IDE with C# or I think it's Java and Eclipse. But basically, they're already using TFS. A lot of the developers were already in there. They could create unit tests in the exact same IDE that they're already running that are in ALM, and they can run those unit tests, provide even more insight, and provide a little bit more detail to the testers as far as, maybe this feature worked, but the end-to-end test broken. So LeanFT, we recommend getting more information. Ask us or HP about that. We'd love to give you more information. ALI, synchronizing their build, their source code management and build servers with ALM. That's a free feature if you have the ALM license of the tool and you do have build servers that are compatible with it. It also works with Git as well as TFS, Subversion. I think there's some other. It's constantly changing and adapting, and you'll probably see a lot more of that in ALM Octane. Requirements, linkages with requirements, using automatic mail reports, using the reporting features they have in ALM, using Test Lab more efficiently, using the releases, even if they're not dedicating a release to the exact activity they're doing, at least having it to be a bucket to aggregate everything that's happened in a fiscal year, or automatically provide linkages. It gives you a lot of benefits there. Dashboard and reporting. Since they were doing pre-production build, it's pretty much been tested pretty thoroughly, but there's risk-based quality management that we notice, requirements traceability, cross-project customization, and project planning and tracking is another feature that if you have the ALM license, you can get a whole overview of all of your test execution and whatnot. So gap analysis, I'm just going to skip through this really quick. We found some other additional things that could benefit them. If you missed out on the last Vivit presentation, we did talk about network virtualization and service virtualization. LeanFT is fantastic for performance testing, mobile testing, structure reporting, and potentially analyzing software as a service as something that could benefit them. And continuous integration, not even having anybody have to click a button. If you leverage ALI, every time a build gets checked in, you can have your regression tests automatically kicked off. So that's another thing too. So the conclusion is by adapting our recommended tool usage and performance recommendations, we increase the overall efficiency and application health visibility, streamline processes. The gap analysis roadmap provides a solid plan for the future so they can see where they want to be in the next few years. Using the recommended UFT script enhancements, so removing all of their massive function libraries and object repositories, and the automation execution helped reduce their automated executions in excess of 50%, and then spreading executions across multiple time slots and in automatically allocating hosts in conjunction with that, reduce some of their largest regression runs from 3 days down to 6 hours. So that is the conclusion. And thank you guys.
Six hours. Wow.
That was massive.
3 days to 6 hours.
There were some definite improvements that we made.
Thank you for joining this presentation from the second Vivit Seattle Chapter meeting of 2016. That's another special thanks to Louis for presenting. And if you have any more questions, please direct them to info@bienabee.com. We provide professional services geared towards making the HPE ALM toolset work better for you and your organizations. Thanks, YouTube.